Okay, so thank you and good morning again. Welcome to our September 2021 meeting. And I want to start off the meeting with recognizing this month the support that I've received over the past several months from our management committee. And I want to specifically recognize the work of a few of the committee members. Tom Evans has coordinated this year's inter-club golf tournament to be teeing off on September 24. And this will be the 33rd annual tournament. So thank you, Tom. And I want to thank Kevin Harraher for his coordination of the speakers program. Kevin has speakers lined up for the rest of the year. And then he's going to step aside from his leadership role. But he has assured us that he will stay involved in a mentoring role. So thank you very much, Kevin, for all your work. And Bob Dickinson, our membership chairman, has been leading our Zoom technology. And he's now our contact person at the art gallery as it moves forward towards reopening in person and setting up hybrid meetings. So thank you for your help, Bob. And another Bob Lalonde, is coping with health issues. And Gary Hinley has taken over the role of communications, which includes the newsletter and the uploading of our recordings to YouTube. So thank you, Gary, for all your help. And finally, a well-deserved thank you to Bob Lalonde for his long serving contribution to our club. Bob led a number of technical initiatives, including the web page and our use of YouTube and Constant Contact. So with those thank yous, I would like to hand over the program to our first Vice President, Brian, to introduce today's speaker. Thank you.
Hi, I have the privilege of introducing Karina Gould. I'm going to give a little bit of her background. You're familiar with recent events, obviously, but Karina grew up in Burlington and graduated from M.M. Robinson High School. After graduation, she spent a year volunteering at an orphanage in Mexico. Upon her return, Karina attended McGill University, graduating in 2010. She was employed by the Organization of American States in Washington. Subsequently, she returned to school and earned her master's degree in international relations at Oxford University, after which Karina moved back to Burlington and worked as an investment and trade specialist for the Mexican Trade Commission in Toronto. In 2015, Karina became a candidate for Parliament. She won that election and has been our member of Parliament since. 2017, she was appointed Minister of Democratic Institutions before she turned 30. In 2019, she was re-elected as MP and appointed Minister of International Development. Just a bit of background on this. We invited Karina months before the election was called to speak to us as Member of Parliament. And it was on the basis it would be a non-partisan presentation, and that stipulation was agreed. And I'd like to point out that our guest Karina has a hard stop by 11 o'clock. She's going from meeting to meeting today, and she needs to leave for another meeting by 11 o'clock. So it's my pleasure to introduce Karina Gould for this morning's presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brian. It's great to see you. And I see a lot of familiar faces on the call. So good morning to everyone. And thank you for having me this morning. As Brian mentioned, I think we actually set this up back in March. So delighted to be here with you today. And I was going to speak about some of the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic today. And I know that you've offered me 15 to 20 minutes to speak, but even though I'm a politician, I'll try to take a bit less time than that and hopefully have a good opportunity for some questions and answers and some discussion. But the last 18 months, I mean, I'm not telling you anything new, have been incredibly difficult. They've been difficult for people of all ages, of all diversities, of all backgrounds. We've had what is the largest health and economic crisis since the Second World War in our country, and it's required a whole of country effort to respond. And one of the things that I often think about is just how much Canadians have stepped up over the past 18 months. And when I think about the vantage point that I've had as your member of parliament in these last 18 months, it's the incredible generosity and kindness and resilience of our community that sticks with me. I have also been the subject of, some very difficult and challenging moments. I have twice been arrested in absentia by anti-maskers and anti-vaxxers who have threatened me, for which I've required RCMP detail over the last 18 months. And so it's been a difficult time, but I also know that that's the minority. I know that the vast majority of people in our community are kind, are generous, are resilient, and have done what needs to be done to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. And I had a conversation in May of 2020 with Mary Robinson. And some of you might recognize that name. She was the first female president of Ireland. She's a member of the elders. She worked very closely with Nelson Mandela. And in her retirement has become a champion for climate action, for women's rights, and for the advancement of all people on this planet. And so I had this call with her in my capacity as Minister of International Development. And she was sharing with me that there are 5 lessons that she thinks we've learned from COVID-19 that we can apply more broadly in society, but particularly to the climate crisis. And so I thought I'd share those lessons with you and talk a little bit about each of them. The first one is that science matters. The second is that governance and who governs matters. The third is that collective action matters. The fourth is that individual action matters. And the fifth is that compassion matters. And I've thought a lot about these 5 lessons. And I think what it is it's a guide for us in terms of how we deal with almost any crisis. But it was really magnified by COVID-19. Because each of these 5 lessons, if applied and when applied, means that different countries, different regions, different provinces have responded differently to the COVID-19 pandemic with different outcomes. So the first one is that science matters. And I hope that all of us on this call can agree that COVID-19 is real, that it's had a significant impact on our lives, but we've also learned a lot about it over the last 18 months. You know, in March of 2020, when the world was shutting down and we were preparing for what was to become one of the biggest pandemics this world has ever seen, none of us really knew what to expect. Because except for maybe a few people who were born in the 1918s who survived the Spanish flu when they were maybe infants, none of us really knew what was coming. And we couldn't really compare it to SARS or H1N1 because the difference with COVID-19 was that it was so unbelievably contagious and it spread so quickly. And we have learned so much about aerosol transmission, about mask wearing, about the importance of social distancing, about the importance of vaccines. And we've seen that vaccines are one of the key tools to keeping us all safe. And here in Burlington, 85% of people have gotten fully vaccinated. That is we are one of the top vaccinated communities in our country. And that's a testament to the wonderful people in our community who've stepped up and done the right thing. But we also know that when we don't follow the science, we have very different outcomes. And we can see this happening right now in Alberta with just 60% of the population vaccinated. It's becoming a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We know that vaccines work. We have incredible data and evidence over the last 100 years. I'm speaking to you as provost, but I've spoken to most of the Rotary clubs in Burlington. And one of the things that Rotary does is they raise money for the fight against polio. Canada was one of the leading countries. Everyone knows the story of Joseph Salk and the invention of the polio vaccine and the decision that Paul Martin Sr. made when he was the Minister of Health to say, no, we're going to move forward with polio vaccines. A lot of people in my generation don't really know what polio is. And the reason is because we've been vaccinated, because polio is not an issue in Canada anymore. There are only two countries in the world where polio remains endemic, and that's Afghanistan and Nigeria. And that's because of low vaccination rates. But we are this close to eradicating polio. We've eradicated smallpox. We don't have to deal with the horrible tragedies of so many contagious diseases because of vaccines. And we need to keep pushing and keep making sure that as many Canadians as possible who are eligible get vaccinated. And I'm sure many of you on this call have family members who maybe are immunocompromised, who are at greater risk of COVID-19. Maybe you have children or grandchildren that are under the age of 12. I have a son who's 3.5. He can't get vaccinated. So it's my job as his mom, as an adult, as someone who's eligible to do my part to protect those who can't. And for me, that's something that's incredibly important. I was talking to a former teacher of mine. She was a science teacher, and she was saying, what can we do to get back to understanding science in our communities? How can we make sure that people are trusting and relying on the experts? Because we know what we need to do, but we need to get everybody on board. So the first lesson is science matters. The second one is governance, and who governs matters. And again, we have seen this throughout the pandemic. I mean, we can compare just here in Canada versus the United States. If we think about the first 12 months of the pandemic, how Canada was able to manage versus how the United States was able to manage, over 500,000 people in the United States have lost their lives because of COVID-19, because governors and different leaders in the United States made the decision not to lock down, not to protect people's lives. We're seeing the difference in our own country right now with what's happening in Alberta. I'm sure you are all following the news over the past week. Alberta made the decision to be open, completely open, without getting vaccine rates up, right? 60% are vaccinated, 40% are not. They've now shut down all surgeries. Their ICUs are overflowing with COVID-19 patients, predominantly unvaccinated. I was just reading in my daily brief this morning, 0.08% of COVID patients are fully vaccinated, right? This is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. Vaccines work, and government and who governs and the decisions that they take matters, and it has an impact on whether people live or die. You know, people often ask me why I ran for office in the first place. And I ran for office in the first place because I know that government and who governs matters. And the decisions that are being taken in capitals impact people's lives every single day. And there is nothing that makes this clearer than a global pandemic, because the decisions that we take literally can be life or death for some people. And I believe very strongly that as a member of parliament, as a cabinet minister, our job, our duty is to do everything we can to protect the safety and the well-being of our population. And when I think about some of the actions that we took over the past 18 months, we did just that. You know, in March 2020, when we closed everything down because we didn't know what was going to happen, we did two things that were really important. The first one is we recognized that the best way to save lives was to keep people home. But the only way that we could keep people home is if they had the income supports that they needed. At the height of the first wave, 9.5 million Canadians were reliant on CERB. 9.5 million Canadians who, if they didn't have that emergency benefit, would have been unemployed, without income, unable to pay for their food, unable to pay for their mortgage, unable to pay for their rent. And I remember visiting our food bank in Burlington in that spring. And I asked Robin, the executive director, have you seen a huge increase? And he said, no, because people are getting the emergency benefit. We were prepared, we were worried, we were ready. But actually, because of CERB, we didn't see that skyrocketing in demand that we thought we would, because people who are unemployed were able to get through. We also provided the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy to companies to ensure that they could retain their employees, because we knew that if we were going to restart our economy once we got through the pandemic, that employers needed to retain their staff. They needed to be able to turn that switch back on. 700,000 businesses got the Canada Emergency Business Account, a $40,000 loan from the Government of Canada, $10,000 of which was forgivable. 700,000 businesses were able to continue operating because of the support from the Government of Canada. We needed to keep our economy afloat to make sure that we could thrive once again. And when we look at the jobs numbers, it's clear. In the United States, they've only recovered 75% of the jobs that they lost during the pandemic. In Canada, it's 92%. That's a stark difference. Government and who governs matters. Now, the third lesson was collective action. And this one I think is really important because it's recognizing that we all have to act together, whether it's vaccines to retain herd immunity, whether it's staying home to stop the spread of COVID-19, whether it's supporting our frontline healthcare workers. All of us working together matters. And this goes right from the individual in their home to our community here in Burlington coming together, to working with the provinces and territories, to the response of the federal government. We have demonstrated as Canadians that we can take these collective actions. And the fourth lesson, individual actions matters. We all have the power and the ability to have an impact on what happens to us as a collective. As an individual, me getting double vaccinated means that I've protected myself, but more importantly, it means I've protected someone who can't get vaccinated. Because there are people for legitimate medical reasons who simply cannot get vaccinated, and there are those that are under 12 who are not yet eligible. My individual action of wearing a mask protects me, but more importantly, it protects you. My individual action of staying home at the height of the pandemic meant that I wasn't getting COVID-19 and I wasn't spreading it to others. That combination of individual and collective action meant that we could have a strong response to COVID-19. And then the final lesson, which I think is really important, is that compassion matters. And caring and having a view and empathy for others, I think is what gets us through this pandemic. It's looking at somebody else and understanding where they are in their lives and where they are in the moment in which you meet them, and seeing what they too are doing or what they have sacrificed or how they have suffered, and saying, I appreciate that and I recognize that and I support you. And again, this is why things like the CERB were so important, and why supporting people who've lost their jobs to make sure that they can get through the pandemic is really important. And so for me, these 5 lessons guide me every single day. Science matters, governance matters, collective action matters, individual action matters, and compassion matters. And when I think about these 5 lessons and how they apply to the pandemic, I can see how they can apply to any other crisis that we are dealing with as humanity. And I take that and I apply that to the climate crisis. You know, when I'm asked, what is the #1 issue facing Canadians right now? Absolutely, it's finishing the fight against COVID-19, because we're not going to get back to doing the things we love with the people that we love in a way that we love doing it until we get this pandemic behind us for good. But when I think about what's looming in the background is the climate emergency. And if we are able to get through this pandemic, to finish it for good, taking those 5 lessons and applying them, we can take those 5 lessons and apply them to the climate crisis. We have to listen to the science. It's clear. We need to significantly reduce our greenhouse gases. We need to keep our global temperatures below 2 degrees. We are warming below 2 degrees. And we know what to do, and we can do it. And in fact, our government is doing it. One of the things that I am most excited about is 2 of the investments in our community that we've made over the past year. The first is with regards to Ford. And I'm going like this because I'm facing south. So on my left is Oakville and on my right is Hamilton. But east of us at the Ford plant in Oakville is one of the most exciting investments that I think we have received in our community. So the federal government and the provincial government each invested $300 million, which leveraged a $1.4 billion investment from Ford Motor Company to transform the Oakville plant into a plant that produces zero emission vehicles. That's huge because, first of all, it's going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by making sure that our personal motor vehicles are ZEVs. But second of all, it's securing thousands of good paying jobs right here in our community. That's what taking bold climate action looks like. It's understanding that the environment and the economy go together, and you can't have one without the other. The second investment that I'm really jazzed about is at Dofasco. Just over a month ago, I was with Chrystia Freeland and we announced $400 million in support from the federal government, which leveraged $1 billion investment from ArcelorMittal, which is going to get rid of the smokestacks at Dofasco. That's the equivalent of taking 1.8 million cars off the road in our community every year. That's more personal vehicles than Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto combined. Those are huge reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But it's also securing thousands of jobs in the steel industry right here in our community for the next 100 years. It's understanding that we will not be a jurisdiction of choice for investors if we go backwards on climate change. If we don't make those really important moves forward to make sure that our economy will be strong moving into the 21st century, while we're also protecting our planet. Minister McKenna likes to say there is no planet B. We only have this one. And so for me, again, it's this understanding that science, governance, collective action, individual action, and compassion matters. And we can apply this to any of the crises that we're facing. And so I'm going to stop my talk there because I think that there's going to be some really interesting discussion and some questions and answers. And I would like to be able to be part of that conversation. And I did try to keep my talk, I think, around 10 minutes. So I did my best there, but I'm really looking forward to what I hope will be an engaging conversation. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. And so if we go into the Q&A now, as we usually do, everyone's on mute now. So if when you have a question, raise your hand and Gary will identify you. Take yourself off mute, ask your question, and please put yourself back on mute after you finish your question. And if you don't, I think Bob's going to put you on mute. So since I've got the floor, I'm going to take the advantage of asking the first question. And I was going to say, Ms. Gould, that if you look at the audience in front of you, our provost members tend to show a bit of gray hair. And many of our members are grandfathers. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask you, given your experience in the public and the private sector, what key pieces of advice would you offer a young woman in grade 12 who's about to head off to university or college or about to enter the workforce? What are your key pieces of advice for that young woman?
Be bold and believe in yourself, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't do what you want to do, because you can. There have been a lot of people in my life who have said that as a young woman, I would not be able to be elected, that don't take me seriously, but just be tenacious, because you are smart, you are brilliant, and you are capable, and the future is all yours. And if that young woman needs someone to shore her up and believe in her, ask your grandfather, who will hopefully be your biggest champion and your biggest cheerleader, and who has hopefully built a world that will open every door for you.
Kevin, you have a question? You're still muted, Kevin.
Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Karina, that was a lovely talk. I really enjoyed it. Just a question that I have 3 daughters and they've all gone in different directions. So, and they've all, done, as you say, they've all been bold and they've pushed, and, and I love that, So my question to you, Karina, is if you hadn't gone into politics at grade 12, or wherever you were in your life, if you hadn't gone into politics, what do you think you'd be doing today?
Well, so before I went into politics, I was working in international relations. So I think I probably would have continued in that regard. My dream was actually to be a diplomat. That's what I wanted to do. But when I graduated from university, Stephen Harper's government had actually put a freeze on hiring within the Foreign Service. So I couldn't even apply for the job that I wanted. But I luckily managed to now be the head of the Foreign Service as the Minister of International Development. So even though I couldn't apply at the time, as luck would have it, I now get to represent Canada internationally as Minister of International Development. But certainly that was the path that I was on, both at the Organization of American States and in the work that I was doing with the Mexican government. And I think I would have continued in that path.
Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other hands. Karina, I had a quick question for you. You talked about the Ford plant switching over to electric vehicles. 10 years ago, I was all electric in my house, but because of the time of day electric coming in, I decided to switch over to gas heating and gas water heater and all this stuff. So now I'm polluting more than I used to. Is there any future thoughts on maybe switching people back to all electric in their houses?
Yeah, it's a great question, Gary. And yes, the answer is yes. And one of the interesting nuances in Canada is that we don't actually have a national power grid. They're provincial power grids, and most of our power travels north-south. So we have an incredible abundance of electric power, but whether it's Manitoba Hydro or Quebec Hydro, a lot of it goes north-south. And so one of the things that we would do if, and I know we're not supposed to talk about elections, so I apologize, but if we were reelected, would be to create a national energy grid, and basically to create a group of experts to talk about how we can move to more electric generation, and also switching over for individual homes as well as businesses, because we know that it is a cleaner source of power. But we need to do more in that direction. And then we also need to build up the national infrastructure. So over the past 6 years, we've built 50,000 electric vehicle charging stations. So you can now drive from coast to coast on in your electric vehicle. But we want to build another 75,000 to make it more convenient for people. And then we have to have that broader conversation about what this means at the individual, the homeowner level, as well as we're doing this transition away from fossil fuels to cleaner energy sources. It's a really good question.
Ray, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, is it important that we continue to pursue the origins of COVID-19? In the recent past, the American intelligence community has ruled that other than being able to establish the initial case arose in Wuhan province, they haven't been able to determine the source of it, whether it was zoonosis or whether it was an escape from a lab, or what the situation is. Should we continue to pursue, as the WHO is wanting to do, to pursue where this arose?
Yeah, I really think we should. I think it's a really good question. I think it's really important, because if we're going to prepare for what inevitably will be another pandemic, hopefully not anytime soon, it's really important for us to know what the origins are. I think, the latest report that I read from the WHO is that while they haven't been able to rule out officially that it's an escape from a lab, they are leaning much more towards it being zoonotic in origin. And in fact, that would be quite consistent with most of the other pandemics that we have, whether it was SARS, avian bird flu, H1N1, HIV, for example, that mostly Ebola originates in animals and then is kind of jumps over into the human species. And this is actually something that I think is really important and that we need to spend more time talking about, because there's a connection between, human health, climate change, and biodiversity loss. As we as humans encroach more and more in kind of the wild world, we're exposing ourselves to many diseases and viruses and pathogens that humans haven't really come into contact with. And in kind of a funny turn of events, the last trip I took before COVID-19 kind of shut the world down was to the Democratic Republic of Congo and I went to the Ebola zone in Goma because Canada is one of the major donors when it comes to the Ebola response in the DRC. And I actually had the chance to meet Dr. Mukwege, who was the Congolese scientist who discovered Ebola back in the 1970s. And he was sharing with me, the fact that a lot of these diseases come from either wet markets, so humans purchasing and consuming wild animals, or they come from, being bit by a bat, out in the forest, or eating a bat or something like that. And so I think that more needs to be done and understood about, what the human impact on our natural spaces means for human health. And the WHO and the EU and the G20 right now are leading at what's called a One Health initiative, which basically looks at the intersection between human health, animal health, and planetary health. And I think this is something that we need to keep pursuing. So, whether or not, COVID-19 originated in a lab or whether it came from a human interaction with an animal, we need to understand it and we need to know about it so that we can prepare for future pandemics. So I do think this is really important. And the EU and the UK right now are also pursuing like a pandemic treaty, which would basically say that every country in the world who signs on to it would agree to kind of full investigations in terms of if a pandemic originates within their territory or what role they have. And so I have been very strong in my conversations as Minister of International Development. I'm one of the key interlocutors with the WHO. And so for me, I have been very forceful and strong with Tedros to say that the WHO needs to take this seriously, and Canada will support that kind of investigation.
Stan Rogers, you had a question? Stan, you're on mute.
Yep. I'm sorry. Mine is not a question because I have to make a brief statement. Number one, I was nearly killed at age 2 by measles.
Mm-hmm.
This completely revolutionized my life and how I went. The other thing is my profession was a patent attorney or patent agent. Now, one of the peculiar things about being a patent agent is the client comes in to see you and describes his invention to you. We don't think immediately, oh, in a year or two, I've got to file a patent or get a patent for him. You try to think, I've got to think that that patent will last for 20 years. And I have got to think ahead to that 20 years for it. This is why I really understand your situation, where every 4 or 5 years, you have to worry about whether you're going to be reappointed. I just wish you had personally, I just wish you had a much longer time than that. But it does change your attitude towards it. Another matter is the fact that I see so many times inventions come in, ideas come in, and one, they perhaps don't have enough money, and two, the failure rate is quite high. So that these wonderful, the ones like the modern vaccines, for example, they completely revolutionized the mRNA vaccines. They were thought of 25 years ago, but until somebody provided them with $500 million to develop them, we didn't get there. Meanwhile, I don't know how many other got lost on the way. I'm sorry. Otherwise, as you can see, I have to be careful. Otherwise, I could talk for the next couple of hours, as my members here know damn well. So I'll shut up and say thank you for coming, and thanks for what you've already said. So let's keep going from there.
Well, maybe I can just make a comment on that, Stan. So first of all, thank you for your comments, because, you know, one of the things that I find difficult is, you know, my generation and younger who, because they have been protected by vaccines, don't appreciate how important vaccines are.
Yeah.
And when I was in the Congo, so we were so focused on Ebola, right? Ebola had killed 2,400 people in the DRC when I was there over the course of 12 months. But at the exact same time, there was a measles outbreak that had impacted 300,000 children, and 6,000 children died. And nobody was talking about that, right? We were so focused on Ebola, which is horrific and terrifying and awful. But at the same time, we cannot ignore those other communicable diseases. And, you know, I think one of the things that for me is most worrisome is those of my peers who don't want to vaccinate their children because they don't know what vaccination actually does and what it prevents, right? And so that's one thing. And then the other one is just on your final point on mRNA technology. I mean, it is so exciting. It is so exciting. There's so much potential with it. And this is where, again, I think the couple of the lessons of science and collective action. I mean, the fact that we have not just one, but several COVID-19 vaccines is a modern miracle in such a short period of time. And it's because the world came together, right? Invested billions of dollars at the same time to try and conquer, you know, this virus. And so I you know, science rules, right? And that collective action matters. And it's just a testament to what humans can do when we're working together. So thank you for those comments.
Thank you.
Bill, you want to go ahead? Bill Velcor?
Yes, sorry about that. I was on mute. My question relates to travel to the US, Karina. And that's pretty easy today. You just need to go down to the airport and you're in the US. My concern is when they remove the restrictions on land crossing, that'll probably come with some type of vaccination requirement. And I was vaccinated with Pfizer, followed by Moderna because Pfizer wasn't available. And if I understand the situation correctly, WHO does not recognize mixed vaccines. That is a mixture of Pfizer and Moderna. Does Canada have any influence on that, or is there any thoughts about something I could do, such as get another Pfizer or another Moderna to meet the requirements that are there?
Sure, good question. So the US currently has no plans to require vaccination to go to the United States. The only organizations that are doing that are kind of like private cruise lines, is my understanding. But that's just if you're leaving from a port in the United States. But from every conversation that we've had with US officials, they have no plans to require vaccination for entry into the US. It's a very interesting question because there are very few countries in the world that will not have a mixed dose schedule now, just because of the ability to procure. So Europe is pretty much in the same boat as Canada. They, mixed Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, well, those are really the three main ones. And I would say that almost every other country in the global South is doing a mix because a lot of countries have, after watching what happened in Canada, followed our strategy of getting a first dose strategy, getting as many people immunized with a first dose before moving on to a second one. And in many cases that necessitated a mixing of doses. And so the WHO actually in the last call that I was on was praising Canada's strategy as one to follow. And they have said that actually what they're seeing in preliminary results is that those who have mixed vaccines actually end up with a stronger immune response than those that have used the same vaccine. And so we are currently working alongside our counterparts in most countries in the world, maybe with the exception of the US and Israel, that were able to vaccinate with the same vaccines for recognizing 2 doses for WHO approved vaccines. So that's kind of going to be the benchmark for the WHO. And we want to create and we are advocating right now for international standards so that we can do this. I mean, right now in Canada, we are only accepting 2 doses from vaccines that are Health Canada approved. So that's the Johnson & Johnson, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and Pfizer vaccines. So, you know, for example, my mother-in-law in Mexico was vaccinated with Sinovac. So if she comes to Canada, she would have to quarantine for 2 weeks because we don't recognize Sinovac in Health Canada. But I think eventually where we will get to is all WHO approved vaccines will be recognized. And that's certainly what we're working on as a global community.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions, or should we be wrapping this up?
I have another question if I could. You know, I don't want to hog the scene or anything, but you know, you talk about, Karina, I think this is a bit back on the health thing. You talk about collective action, you know, and people all joining together to get things done. When you look at the health system in Canada and the health sort of actions that different provinces have taken and how they're struggling, you know, Kenny was on the television there. He was almost in tears, like, you know, what's gone wrong with the health system in Canada, or, you know, individually by province, that we seem to be struggling every time there's a wave or a half a wave. All of a sudden we're in crisis mode. How do we get through that? Like this, do we have to live with this for, you know, all of these elective surgeries being put on the back burner, people not being able to get MRIs, like my son needs an MRI and it's 2022 before he can get one. You know, what can we do to improve the health system and make it world class?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And I also, Gary, I noticed, I don't know if your name is actually Blue, but the gentleman whose name is Blue Metter, he's put his hand up a couple of times. So maybe you can turn to him afterwards. But it's a really good question, Kevin. I mean, look, our strategy in Canada has mostly been to avoid a collapse of the health system. Right? That has been the reason why we have encouraged people to stay home, why we have done that, because we know what our health system capacity is. And our capacity is already stretched in Canada in normal times, right? But what happens with COVID is that our ICU capacity is just not built for a pandemic, to be totally honest. And so we have tried to maintain that, but I think what happened primarily in Alberta is that the government refused to listen to the scientists. The scientists have been saying to them since June, do not open fully. We do not have the capacity. We do not have the vaccination rates. We do not have the ability to absorb these additional cases that are going to strain our healthcare system. And unfortunately, Kenny didn't listen to them, and he removed all the restrictions, required no proof of vaccination. And what we've seen is the Delta variant has taken off, but the science tables, the experts, were telling him not to do that from the very beginning. Whereas in Ontario, you know, I think with the Doug Ford government is that they've always gotten to the right decision just 3 weeks too late. And so
that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, and so, but it's really unfortunate because a lot of people get sick or lose their lives because of it, but they eventually get there, right? And so when they start to see that the crisis is getting out of control, okay, then they bring down the hammer, right? But in Alberta, they just let it go and let it go and let it go. And I don't know if it was stubborn ignorance or just, not wanting to admit defeat. But they got to the point where they are now. And so, it's really devastating. Whereas what we saw in the Atlantic provinces and in Quebec is that they said, you know what, we are not going to risk it. We are going to take strong measures from the beginning. And so therefore they didn't see that same kind of explosion in cases, right? And so we've seen across the country that the premier and the decisions that they're making have very different impacts on people's lives and what happens. And, for me, I can tell you one of the most difficult moments that as a cabinet minister, I also sit on the COVID committee. So, we're the cabinet committee responsible for making decisions in Canada, but it was the shock of feeling powerless as a federal cabinet minister, because so many of the decisions that are taken are provincial.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so in February of this year, when the province of Ontario decided to reopen, at the federal level, we were saying, please just hold the line. If you hold the line for 3 or 4 more weeks, we might actually be able to get out of this. And poor Dr. Tam was on the news every day saying case counts are going up. I really recommend provinces don't reopen. I really encourage them not to. They need to hold the line. And what did the Doug Ford government do? They reopened. And then 3 weeks later, it came down like a sledgehammer, and we were in the third wave, in the biggest wave that we've experienced. And so eventually they got to the right decision, but they got there 3 weeks later. And it's the same with vaccine passports. It's the same with masks in schools. It's like they get there, but they get there too late. And I have to say, like, I remember having this conversation with a friend of mine and saying, here I am, a federal cabinet minister. I have all this data in front of me, right? And it's the same data that the provinces have, but I don't have the tools or the levers to make these public health decisions because they're the decisions of the provinces. And so all we can do is say, please don't do this, provide supports, offer supports. But yeah, that has been a very strange experience, because you're like shouting from the rooftops, but the decision maker is over here. And that's a bit of the reality of our federal system. And on the one hand, you could say, well, you could bring in the Emergency Measures Act, but then that would make the federal government, like, we would have to administer the entire healthcare system. And we don't actually have the capacity to do that at the federal level. So we've already provided incredible surge capacity to public health across the country with contact tracing. We procured all the vaccines, all the PPE, provided billions of dollars in support to the provinces and territories. We sent in the Canadian Armed Forces here in Ontario to dozens of long-term care homes to get the situation under control. We've sent in the Red Cross. We've done everything we can to help with the surge capacity. But those critical decisions that would kind of make the difference are ones that are taken at the provincial level.
Federal issue, yeah. Thanks, Karina. That's a good answer.
Okay, Gary, are there any other?
I think, is it Ken Medland under Blue Matter?
Oh, is that Ken there? Oh, good to see you, Ken. I didn't recognize you on Zoom. I thought that might have been you.
Well, I don't know how that got in there, Karina. I'm not, I just a non-political comment on anything but blue. But anyway, I have a question really on behalf of my children and more importantly, our grandchildren. Is COVID-19 only the tip of the iceberg as far as ongoing pandemics?
Oh, that's a tough question. I mean, the answer is I don't know. I certainly hope not, but I don't know. And I think that, I mean, my hope and my prayer and my desire is that that this is a once in a century pandemic, you know, similar to what we saw with the Spanish flu. But I can't really say that with certainty, kind of because of what I was talking about with regards to just the encroachment on the wild world, right? And, you know, there's this cartoon that that I've shared with a number of my colleagues and friends and people in the community that has it's a city and it has three kind of tsunamis coming at it, right? So there's a little city and then there's a wave and it's the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And it has a little air bubble and it says, COVID-19 is the worst thing that could happen to us. And then it has a bigger one and it's climate crisis. But then it has an even bigger one and that's the collapse of biodiversity. And I just, you know, I don't want to end on a depressing note, but you know, my big worry is that if we don't solve the climate crisis and we don't seriously conserve and conserve our remaining natural spaces, that we are going to be unleashing a whole bunch of other diseases into the human population that we're not prepared for. And if I go back to my conversation or my story about the Congo, there's a really interesting piece that CNN did where they kind of traveled into the heart of the Congolese jungle, and all of the like pathogens, viruses, and diseases that are there that have never come into contact with humans. But if we keep encroaching on that space, what could potentially be released? And so I don't want to sound alarmist because fundamentally I'm a very optimistic person and I believe that we can change the trajectory that we're on. But that does concern me. And so that's why for me, and what I love so much about what Mary Robinson said is that we can apply these lessons from COVID-19 to these other crises and we can bring it under control. It's just the choice is ours to do.
Good. And I think the key thing that you said is it's our choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we have to get off our butts and implement it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Jim Jones, did you have a question? I think this will have to be our last one. We're coming up against our hard stop at 11.
Okay, yes. Thank you. Thank you very much, Karina. Amazing. If I lived in Burlington, political comment, you would have my vote for life. So second thing, one of the points of your 5 points was compassion. I feel that I'm dealing and comprehending most of the points and living them, but I'm having a little problem finding any compassion for anti-vaxxers. How do I deal with that? And number two, the national energy grid that you talked about. I'm a lifetime employee of Ontario Hydro, and I would love to know whether that's just a dream or whether somebody's actively working towards it.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thanks for your support in theory. I appreciate that. But yeah, so maybe I'll start with your second one because it's an easier question than the first one. In that, yes, we are actually working on it. So the Departments of Natural Resources and Environment and Climate Change Canada are working on that right now so that we can have an east to west power grid. And we have to, like, we actually just have to, right? It's not really a question of if, it has to be a question of now and when. So that work is underway. And we are having conversations with the provinces and territories. And, you know, for some of our provinces that are energy superpowers, they're keen on it because they can sell a lot of their hydropower to other jurisdictions, both south of the border, but also east and west of themselves. So that is a real conversation and real action is happening on that. Oh, on your first one, I know that's really hard. And I can't tell you the number of people that I've spoken to at the door over the last 5 weeks who their patience is up with the anti-vaxxers, right? Like they're just done with them. And I think especially because of what we've seen over the last 5 weeks, I mean, just the absolute vitriol and hate and just awful attacks, you know, on the Prime Minister. I've had it myself, as I was mentioning, like I've had to have an RCMP detail twice now because of threats from anti-vaxxers in Burlington, which I never would have imagined ever before. But it really is getting out of control. And I think seeing the protests at hospitals is just, it's just unbelievable, right? Like, my goodness, our frontline healthcare workers have been through hell and more over the last 18 months. And to think that the very people whose lives they're saving, because it's the people who are unvaccinated, who are in ICUs with COVID-19, are the ones that are spitting at them and threatening them, is just, it's just too much, right? And so I hear
I
you.
agree.
Yeah, I hear you. It's hard. It's really hard to have compassion for them. But the only thing that I'll say on that is that I am a partisan person, but running for office has made me appreciate in some ways why people have the views that they have, because I talk to them about a whole bunch of other things. And there's usually something else happening in their lives. And I don't justify or accept or tolerate what they're doing, because we cannot, and we have to draw the line there. But there's usually something else going on, right? And so I think if you can look at those people with compassion in a sense, and, I think you can be frustrated and angry as heck because they, are in many ways like stopping us from getting over COVID-19. But there's something else going on there that they need help with, right? And if we can try and find a way to get them the help that they need, then maybe we're all going to be better off. And so, I think we have to draw the line and certainly not allow them to protest at hospitals. And the Prime Minister announced this week that if we were reelected, we would make it illegal to do that. And there's actually a bill before the Ontario legislature right now to give safe zones around hospitals, because I'm sure all of you have seen those images and heard from people who are, like that gentleman who has a brain tumor, who had to get out and walk through a crowd of unmasked anti-vaxxers to get to Toronto General Hospital for his surgery. Like, it's just, like, it makes you feel sick, right? Like, it just makes you feel absolutely sick to see that. And we shouldn't tolerate that, and we should punish people accordingly. But if we can talk to them and try and figure out what else is going on in their lives before they get to that place, then that's what we should also be trying to do. But I don't know, it's a weird moment right now. It's a really weird moment. I've never experienced this kind of hatred and vitriol and anger that these people in particular are espousing. And we need to figure out a way to get to the root of it, to stop it before it gets any worse.
Thank you.
Karina, I think that we're out of time. I guess the solution is not to spray them down with Lysol, right?
I don't think that would work.
All right, and I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, well, Minister, I'm expecting one of your assistants to walk in and say, next meeting is ready to go. So I want to just thank you on behalf of everyone for a very articulate, thoughtful presentation. I really appreciate your engagement with us this morning, and I would like to thank everyone for your thoughtful questions. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you again, and feel free to jump into your next meeting. So thanks again with all our thanks.
Great, thanks so much. I appreciate it. Take care, everyone. Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.
We're going to end the recording on this presentation, and it's going to be uploaded. I'm not sure exactly when. It'll take a few days for it to get up. But I'd like to thank everyone for coming today. And next month, we're going to have John Boyko, who's a historian at Lakefield College School. He's a prolific writer, and he's going to talk on his topic is going to be how Canada fought the Vietnam War. Very, very interesting presentation ahead. So we're going to stick around after the recording and get into some breakout rooms. So over to you, Bob.